Should over 1 million tons of treated radioactive waste be dumped in the Pacific? Well, Japan is preparing to do so after the International Atomic Energy Agency endorsed releasing Fukushima's nuclear wastewater into the ocean. But while some scientists say the heavily diluted liquid is safe, activists say anger and anxiety are justified. I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is the Fukushima water dump. The controversial plan by Japan to release radioactive wastewater has sparked fear across the region. Local communities and organizations like Greenpeace have strongly opposed the move. The Chinese government says Japan is treating the ocean as its own private sewer. But is there a better option for the 1,000 tanks of liquid waste stored at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant? Let's take a look.
In 2011, a magnitude 9.1 earthquake struck off the coast of Japan. It caused a tsunami that hit the coastal region of Fukushima, cutting power to the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. Without electricity to pump coolant into the reactors, the radioactive fuel began to melt down. It caused an environmental disaster and the evacuation of thousands. 12 years on, millions of tons of contaminated water that had been used to keep the fuel rods cool is being stored in 1,000 huge steel tanks. As a last step in decommissioning the plant, Japan is planning to release the radioactive water into the ocean. The Tokyo Electric Power Company will filter the water, removing all but the smallest amount of radiation, and release it gradually into the Pacific Ocean over the next 30 years. The Japanese government says it meets safety standards set by national and international regulatory bodies. And the International Atomic Energy Agency agrees. After a 2-year review, the nuclear watchdog concluded that the treated water is safe to discharge.
As I say, I stand by the conclusions and the assessment, and I feel extremely confident about it.
However, fierce opposition remains.
The IAEA has no choice but to have a report representing the positions of the United States and Japan due to the budget supported by the two countries.
We remind Japan of its international obligations to prevent exposure to hazardous substances, to conduct environmental impact assessments of the risk that the discharge of water may have, to prevent transboundary environmental harms, and to protect the marine environment.
China has demanded that Tokyo reach an agreement with other countries in the region before it releases the water.
For such a long-lasting discharge, who will monitor it? How will it be monitored? And how will the credibility of monitoring be guaranteed? None of these issues have reached a conclusion. Our request is very simple, that Japan should suspend the plan to release the water into the sea, carefully negotiate with the international community, and jointly explore a scientific, safe, transparent handling method, which is agreed by all parties.
Hundreds of protesters have made their feelings known in Seoul, including some South Korean lawmakers.
We cannot understand or overlook Japan, which considers itself as an advanced economy and one of the two largest countries in Asia, failing to comply with the principle of disposal of nuclear waste within its own country and going ahead with the illegal and immoral action, which has a significant negative impact on neighboring countries and humanity as a whole.
In South Korea, residents have rushed to buy salt and seafood, fearing those items may soon become contaminated. But Japan is pushing ahead, with some reports suggesting that the first Fukushima water could be released as early as next month.
So, should we be worried, and why, if the IAEA says this wastewater is safe? Well, joining me now to debate that are, from Hokkaido, Japan, Susanne Klien, an associate professor in the Modern Japanese Studies program at Hokkaido University. From Beijing is China commentator and host at CGTN Radio, Zhao Ying. And from Perugia, Italy, is Richard Connor. He's the editor-in-chief of the United Nations World Water Development Report, but he joins us today in his personal capacity, not on behalf of the United Nations. So thanks, everyone, so much for being with us. Susanne, I'll start with you. Japan is going to do this, but should they, and do they really have a choice?
Great question. Thank you. First of all, I think there is a huge gap between the governmental stance and the local grassroots level. Fishermen have already protested, saying that they are extremely worried about the damage to the reputation of their goods. And just to kind of remind everyone that the quantity of fish taken right now, more than 10 years after the Great East Japan earthquake, is only 20% of the quantity caught before the triple disaster. So just keeping in mind the enormous damage that the fishing industry has already taken, it's kind of reasonable that they are worried. And yesterday there were meetings between the government and the local fishermen federation, where the association again emphasized that they're against this measure. And
why? Yes. I mean, that's a very strong argument you're putting forward. So why has it been taken into consideration and just ignored? I mean, is there really a better option then that TEPCO and the Japanese government isn't taking advantage of because perhaps it's more costly for the industry?
Yeah, absolutely. The economic argument is always, I think, they are not becoming creative enough to think about other options. There are options like working with microbes, which may take longer, but I think time needs to be considered in this case, given the disastrous consequences. Even if, from a purely scientific point of view, there is some discussion about how damaging this is, but I think we can't really take this risk now. And we need to think about the global implications as well.
Okay. Unfortunately, it seems we've lost Richard for the moment. So, Susanne, one more question for you. You talk about we can't take the risk now, but we're hearing this argument as well that there are risks on the opposite side. If we leave those hundreds and hundreds of tanks filled with this effectively radioactive water and another earthquake should hit, again, you're risking massive contamination if it isn't treated and properly disposed of in the ocean as TEPCO wants.
Yeah, I agree about the earthquake risk, which is always a risk in Japan. But I think it's not like we only have the option of releasing the stuff into the oceans. There's other options that need to be considered. And also, one reason why I'm a bit skeptical about this one only option is that the deadlines that have been presented for how long the tanks kind of last have been rolling. So already a year ago, people were saying that we have reached, the government has been saying that we've reached the end of the tanks, we have reached our limit, and now they're talking about 2024. So this is an indication, in my opinion, that they're not being creative enough. They're not making an effort.
Very interesting. Susanne, I'll come back to you because I think the process you were talking about as one of the options is called bioremediation, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. We can talk about that further in just a minute, but let me get to Zhao first because obviously, as you know, China has now banned, Japanese imports, particularly seafood imports. Is that a responsible and necessary response?
Well, of course, I think the Chinese government has a responsibility to ensure food safety and protect the health of its consumers. And I believe even without such an import ban, the market itself will make choices based on consumer preferences because, there's a lot of discussions lately on Chinese social media about finding alternatives for cosmetics made in Japan. And also there's a high level of anxiety over seafood and other food products from Japan. And, some people are even so pessimistic about the long-term environmental impact of Japan's actions. And they say they would just refrain from having children. So, you cannot dismiss people's concerns by simply saying that this is safe. I think there's a lack of openness and transparency there. And since the move is unprecedented, I think no one knows for sure about its long-term impact, right? And just to simplify, it is like choosing between two steamed buns. One is plain and the other contains diluted nuclear contaminated water, which one are you going to choose? I think the answer is clear, right? And, I think the Japanese government also should listen to the voices of its own people, especially the voices of the fishermen. It took a really long time to rebuild confidence on Japanese food following the 2011 earthquake and tsunami. But if the Japanese government proceeds with this plan to release radioactive water into sea, all those efforts will be undone. So, the Japanese government may feel that they have chosen what appears to be the most cost-effective solution, but the long-term economic consequences may exceed their initial expectations.
Okay, you've noted that they might feel it's cost-effective, which some might see as a criticism. They just feel this is genuinely the best way to deal with this waste matter. But you've also pointed out, and probably rightly so, this is pretty uncharted territory, and you've made the point that you believe TEPCO itself doesn't have the most reliable history, and that it's failed to actually filter out radioactive chemicals in the waste it produces before. Tell us about that. What do you know particularly about TEPCO's history and why they shouldn't be, in your opinion, entirely trusted on this decision?
Yes, first of all, in theory, the water will be treated before being dumped into the sea to remove most of the radioactive elements except tritium, which chemically is difficult to separate from water. And then TEPCO has promised to dilute the water to bring tritium level below regulatory standards before discharging. So the problem is, TEPCO has a history of failing to filter out those radioactive chemicals. For instance, in 2018, it acknowledged that apart from tritium, there are some more dangerous isotopes which with longer radioactive lifetimes that can slip through this ALPS process. So this, I believe, raises doubts about the reliability and long-term effectiveness of the treatment system. And also, I think if we look at the IAEA report, it says the discharge of the treated water would have a negligible radiological impact to people and the environment. So I think there's a certain level of ambiguity in the language here, because how are you going to define negligible impact? Certainly that does not mean no impact, right? So will it have an impact on vulnerable groups such as children or pregnant women? And what about its impact on sea animals? Tritium can accumulate in the food web. As those larger organisms eat smaller contaminated ones, then eventually this will find its way into the human body. Okay. And then could this lead to gene mutations? Even a single species undergoing gene mutations can have far-reaching consequences for the entire biological system. So, this is unprecedented because such a massive release of radioactive water into the ocean has never been done before. And the long-term effects on the marine environment, on food safety, and on public health remain uncertain. Yeah.
Zhao, I'm glad to say, actually, we finally have Richard back. Richard, I don't know how much of the conversation you've heard so far, but you tell us if you think Japan has chosen the best option for disposing of this tritium-tainted water, and do you trust the IAEA's, report, its conclusion that this is safe, and also its use, as Zhao was pointing out, its use of the term negligible impact? Do you see that as too vague to be trusted?
Okay, three questions there. Let's start with the last one, the vague language. Well, there is an amount of uncertainty in the situation. There is on pretty much any scientific based decision that you're going to make. What I understand is the IAEA, to the best of their knowledge and ability, they more or less okayed the what was done by the Japanese, the studies done by the Japanese. So nobody can guarantee that there will be no negative impact. So it's the intensity of it. So it all comes down to risk. Now, there you've got the environmental risk, which is the number one consideration, and then you've got geopolitical risk, the economic risk to the fishermen. So I don't think it's a question of looking that far down on the way to potential gene mutations or anything like that. The solution, the best solution, I don't know economically what the alternatives are, but the important thing is if they move forward is for monitoring, very intense monitoring and transparency. If most
which they've
the
said
bottom of the
they
food
would
chain,
do. Rafael Grossi said very
yeah,
clearly, we will be there to monitor the safety of this dumping for even decades to come if necessary. But people question that because they think there's a conflict of interest for the IAEA, and maybe you can speak to this, knowing the organization, knowing the United Nations as an organization. There's a conflict of interest because the IAEA is massively funded by specifically the United States and Japan. But do you still trust their impartiality?
Actually, I do. And it's not just because it's a UN, because I don't necessarily trust. I'm not necessarily equating the UN with impartiality, but in this particular case, the deputy director general of the IAEA, Mr. Liu, is Chinese. So, so that kind of indicates, for me, it suggests you mentioned the U.S. on one side, yeah, but so I don't think there's that much of a political influence on the decisions of the IAEA.
Okay, let me go back to Susanne, because as a global population, we have demanded, energy generation that we can use to fund or to power our businesses. Nuclear is really sometimes the only option in developed countries that can massively support. So we know that there are going to be certain consequences. And if we have certain scientists telling us that, of course, there's going to be risk, as there always is in science, we still believe this is safe. But still, science aside, it's more about how people perceive and respond to news like this, which in turn can seriously affect economies, like I said, regardless of the science. Some of us will remember, actually, when an outbreak of bird flu in Asia was announced, Europeans started boycotting poultry. So will some businesses be destined to suffer regardless of whether this water is safe or not? And will we just have to accept that?
Yeah, thank you. First of all, the majority of people who have been surveyed in Japan in a newspaper poll, more than 50% was responding that they're against this measure, and they are worried about the impact on the reputation of these goods. So I think, first of all, the opinions of the general population should be respected. There should be more of a dialogue between the government and citizens, but also fishermen's associations. This dialogue has already started, but quite late, I think. And in a way, I don't get the impression that these fishermen have can really make an impact. It seems the decision has already been made, and now the government is trying to give the impression that they are kind of wanting to have a conversation.
Okay.
So just to tick the boxes in a way. So I think this is something that is not really in the interest of civil society. Plus, I would like to also say that creating this kind of precedent is a huge risk in terms of geopolitics, as we've heard before, but also on for bilateral relations between certain countries. So South Korea, Japan, also a lot of islands are worried about the impact. I think Grossi, the director of IAEA, went to the Cook Islands also to kind of do some kind of appeasement there. So it's really a kind of transnational problem. And given also global warming and other issues, I don't think we can just try and go ahead with this experiment. It's highly
Okay.
irresponsible.
So quickly, Suzanne, you had said before that one of the remedies could be this bioremediation. Is it a simple solution, and why are they ignoring it if it is?
I think it's always an economic issue. TEPCO is a company that is obviously catering towards economic profit. So it's very closely collaborating with the Japanese government. So the interest is really to do as has been done before, rather than looking for creative ways, which may take time and funding. So I think it's really trying to do something new, which is not something that is too often done in governmental circles. So I think the real incentive should be to create a competition, for example, for good ideas in that context, and come up with something new, environmentally friendly, and also something that is based on dialogue between different stakeholders.
Okay. Zhao, let me come back to Zhao quickly, because we said at the top of the show, this is going to go forward in all likelihood. This will happen. China's first reaction has been to ban these Chinese imports. What do you see in the longer term as a response to this? Or do you think, as many things tend to do, this kind of, even people that label it hysteria, this hysteria will die down? People will stop worrying about it. We'll get used to things. The fish will prove, or seafood will prove, not to be toxic, or at least enough that's measurable and scary enough. And China will eventually come around and regularize this import relationship with Japan again.
Well, a colleague of mine once had a conversation with a Japanese photographer who documented extensively in Fukushima after the 2011 disaster. And he said he once encountered a little girl who asked him, "Grandpa, when I grow up, will I still have the chance to become a bride?" He said he didn't know how to respond to her at that moment, and he just had to apologize. So, I mean, this impact is really a long term, and I think that the Japanese government really need to think about the future of their generations and the well-being of its descendants. And talking about this Japan's action, I think it sets a very dangerous precedent, because once Japan started to dump its contaminated wastewater into the ocean, other countries may just be encouraged to follow suit, right? And once the Pandora's box is opened, it becomes nearly impossible to close. And we have to understand that dilution does not reduce the overall radioactive dose of the contaminated water. And Japan has refused to provide data on the total dosage, so it raises concern about the cumulative impact on the marine environment, which becomes really difficult to quantify if more countries adopt similar practices.
Okay. I want to get Richard's response. And we just need to note as well, we haven't really explained that tritium is actually found in so many of our daily use products. It is in our environment constantly, whether we're like it or not. It's in the lights, the exit lights I'm looking at right now on our exits here. It's in the wands you see people waving at concerts. It's in glow-in-the-dark watches. It's in everything. But Richard, go ahead. I could see you disagreed with a few of the points you heard there.
Yeah, well, first of all, you stole my point on in 5 years from now, will we even remember this? It reminds me, and I was going to, the swine flus, mad cow disease. I'm not saying that it's necessarily going to be, everything's going to be all right, but so far the evidence suggests yes. And from what I understand, the déversement, the flow of water, the release is going to be not just one big thing, but it's going to be a little bit at a time, which will allow them to monitor. To Ms. Ying's point that this is setting a terrible precedent, and well, yeah, it's never been done before, but we haven't had a nuclear power plant in any country that was devastated by a tsunami before. So this is not, if one country or a plant has been negligible, then that's one thing. But this is an environmental disaster that had consequences. And unfortunately, the Japan plant was right at the wrong place at the wrong time. So I think the international community has to give them a little bit of, understanding. And what I appreciate from the Japanese is the level of transparency, which is not necessarily a trait that applies to other countries, at least at that level of transparency, especially with the UN as an oversight.
Okay, Richard Connor, that will have to be the final word. Very unfortunately, we're completely out of time. For this edition of The Newsmakers, I'd like to thank all three of my panelists. As always, so much for being with us, and our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.